So recently, Sonic Cross Shadow Generations was announced, or however you're supposed to pronounce this game's title, and that got me thinking about Shadow the Hedgehog's characterization throughout the Sonic series. Of course, Shadow is the ultimate life form created to, well, I mean, it's complicated to be honest, but y'all know Shadow. If you're a Sonic fan, you're familiar with Shadow the Hedgehog, Sonic's main rival, whole edgy, brooding type dude. And Shadow's character has been kind of all over the place pretty much forever. In Sonic Adventure 2, when he was first introduced, he was supposed to die at the end of that game, and that was supposed to be his whole story. Yeah, this is Shadow's story. He dies in the end, right? But then the character was so popular, they decided to bring him back, and that brought over some complications, because how do you bring back this character who had this complete arc back in his original game, and how do you make that work, right? And also justify him, you know, being revived, I suppose. It's all kind of tacky, it's all kind of forced, but you kind of accept it. It's just, you know, the reasons why they brought this really cool character back, so whatever. But from a writing perspective, besides that, the biggest complication here is just making his character work after all of that. Like, who is Shadow after his story is done, right? And that's what they tried to figure out with Sonic Heroes and eventually Shadow the Hedgehog 2005, which was kind of a mess in a way. Both of these games were kind of a mess. Sonic Heroes is a bit controversial as far as Sonic games go, and it isn't very story focused, so I guess we can kind of go over it really quickly. In that game, Shadow's brought back and he has amnesia, so we don't even know if that's the real Shadow or not, or just a clone, because Eggman has been making these Shadow androids, even though they're far from perfect. And then, of course, after that, Shadow the Hedgehog, game focused on the character itself, tries to explore that a little bit deeper and basically follows Shadow as he tries to figure out who he is and get his memories back. That game is also kind of a mess for a myriad of reasons. I'm not going to go too deep into it. It has some good ideas, it also has some very bad ideas. On top of it just being a follow your own story type game where there are multiple endings and it's kind of debatable which things actually happened and which things didn't, especially when you add up the actual like through ending you get after getting all the other ones. It's also just a kind of really rushed, try-hard sort of game. I mean, we all know Shadow the Hedgehog 2005. Anthropomorphic Black Hedgehog uses guns to the sound of hardcore metal. And it's kind of sick, but it's also kind of... It raised some eyebrows for good reasons back in the day. And if you ask me personally, like tonally, they were cooking somewhat. They had some really cool ideas, exploring Shadow's backstory, doing more with it, taking this character seriously and giving him some sense. That's all great. It's just in how they presented it, with, you know, the menu sound effects being fucking gunshot sounds. Like, come on. It's a little bit too much, right? And that kind of stained Shadow's reputation. And that only got worse with Sonic 06, which needs no introduction. Another whole situation of a video game right there. One of the most infamous bad video games of all time. That game's story is a similar case where it has some things going for it, especially if you're into Sonic characters and you are into the whole, you know, narrative they've been building up and are fine with taking these characters seriously, which I personally think should be the case. I think these characters have the potential to be interesting and do cool stuff without being limited to kids media, you know, like what's acceptable for, you know, something like Sonic the Hedgehog or how the public perceives Sonic the Hedgehog, which isn't necessarily accurate to who the character actually is by now. 06's story treats Shadow a little bit differently, especially because at the end of Shadow the Hedgehog's true ending, the character basically decides that he's gonna throw away all his past baggage pretty much and try to start over again from the beginning, see where that goes. Basically, like, moving on, even the credit song, the absolute banger of a credit song, by the way, freaking Never Turn Back, so good. Crush 40 does it again. These guys are amazing. It's all about how Shadow is moving on from his past, and you got to see that translated into Sonic 06. In fact, despite all the questionable stuff in that game story, particularly with Sonic and Elise and all that kind of stuff that was kind of weird, and also time travel stuff, which if you really think about it doesn't really add up. Shadow's particular story in 06, I'd argue, is actually pretty good, pretty interesting. His characterization, how he acts, the stuff he does, that's some of the best stuff in that game story, and there is value in that. We got to see a Shadow who's a little bit more mature, he's a little bit grown, he's learned from the past, and as the ending of Shadow 05 kind of implied, he's moved on, he's doing different stuff, he works for Gun now, he's protecting the planet and following Maria's wish in a way that's a little bit more healthy and a little bit more determined. This guy wants to help people, first and foremost. So basically what we get to see here throughout the course of these 3 games is a concise, unified story for Shadow, right? We get to see him coming back, and then there's a lot of messiness in that, and then we got to see the development of his character throughout Shadow 05, despite how flawed that game is. And then we got to see how that leads into the Shadow we see in 06, which, again, flawed-ass game, but it's cool. That thing is cool. That part of the whole story is pretty cool. It all culminates on the final part of Shadow's storyline in 06, where he takes out the inhibitor rings, and we got that awesome fight against Mephiles. Like, it's so cool, right? 06 technically takes a different approach to Shadow, but it feels meaningful. It feels intentional to follow up on the message and conclusion of Shadow 05's story. But then, of course, again, very questionable games had been coming out from the series at around that time. That includes Shadow 05, that includes Sonic 06, so naturally changes would happen. And changes did happen, because after Sonic 06, we got to see very little of our beloved angry little black hedgehog, right? A lot of people associated the darker tone some of the more questionable Sonic games had taken as part of the reason why these games are so bad, and Sega wanted to move away from that. And that included Shadow as a character, pretty much, because he was introduced as almost a symbol of that. From Sonic Adventure 2, he was supposed to be the darker, more serious Sonic with a sad backstory that was kind of messed up with child murder and shit. So naturally, he was just sort of pushed off to the side. Shadow was never truly gone. He would show up on occasion, and of course, he's a very, very popular character, so Sega wouldn't just throw him away completely, right? But going from Sonic Unleashed all the way into Frontiers right now, right? How much of Shadow did we really see? He showed up and had a boss fight in Generations, which was actually pretty good, but that game had pretty much every other Sonic character ever conceived in it as well, so whatever, right? That doesn't mean that much. And then he'd show up in Teen Sonic Racing, basically everywhere where there was a spot for every main modern Sonic character, he would be there, but he barely ever got the spotlight. Throughout pretty much the entirety of the 2010s, disregarding maybe, those few weird episodes of Sonic Boom and all that stuff, Shadow was kind of just gone, right? He wasn't really the focus. Sega didn't want to give Shadow that much attention. Could be argued that, yeah, he showed up in Sonic Forces, he did get the whole episode Shadow DLC, which I guess is a huge spotlight on the character, but that was like a 15-minute DLC for a 2-hour game. His role in that story was also noticeably disappointing too. He basically had no participation at all. Just like every other villain in that game, he was basically part of this sort of false advertisement strategy Sega was following for that game. Such missed potential. But yeah, I guess it exists, and it kind of shows how Sega still sees value in Shadow's character. I believe from some surveys and stuff, Shadow was typically seen as the second most popular character in the series, right after the main Blue Boy himself. And it shows, because people fucking love Shadow, because he's awesome, and he has the potential to be really awesome. We saw that in Adventure 2, we saw that weirdly enough in 06. Shadow can be cool, and Shadow is cool conceptually. Giving Sonic, who's this anime-ass, just friggin' cool character, this dark counterpart to fight against, it's really awesome. It's a very common trope because it's a trope that works, and it fits Sonic like a glove. Plus, he was a pretty well-written character, all things considered. There's a reason the guy got his whole game. The dude is popular, the dude is cool. So I think his presence in Forces specifically kind of goes to show how Sega sees value in the character as an icon, as an image. Like Shadow, he's Sonic's dark rival. People like him. They're gonna market off of that. They're gonna give him his own playable story because people like Shadow, and they're gonna capitalize on that. But that doesn't mean they're gonna put in the effort to actually justify it. Because in that game, Shadow primarily has a presence, and even when he's there, he's just sort of weird. We got to see that also in Teen Sonic Racing and the animation that came along with it, and especially his appearance in the IDW comics, which are amazing. I still gotta make a video on the Sonic IDW comics because I absolutely love them. Ian Flynn is an amazing writer. I showed up on his podcast recently. Dude is really chill, really fun to talk with, and his stories are absolutely great. He really does a great job with these characters in this world that he's clearly just as passionate about as most of us also are. But explicitly due to certain guidelines Sega puts in terms of like what characters are allowed to say, what they're allowed to do, how they're supposed to be characterized as, we saw, even in these very well-written Sonic comics, a version of Shadow that doesn't really mash up with what we saw back in the 2000s, right? We saw a version of Shadow that was more brooding, more oversimplified, just kind of this edgy asshole with no character development, with no story of his own, no personality. He was just sort of there to be Sonic's dark rival, marketing off the idea of Shadow more than the character himself and where he is at this point. I can't really blame the writers for that, since it's so clear that this is very much Sega's fault, and it's the direction they wanted to take the character in. And for example, in those comics, in the first issue he showed up, he was actually kind of cool. He had this really interesting moral divide with Sonic where he thought they should kill Eggman, whereas Sonic didn't want to kill the dude because at that point he was not necessarily evil, long story. But then especially in the Metal Virus arc, Shadow is just kind of an asshole. Is so arrogant and stubborn in a way that doesn't feel like the same Shadow we saw back in 06, the same Shadow we saw back even in Shadow 05 in the final few moments of Sonic Adventure 2. They just threw all that character development out the window to make a more simplified, marketable Shadow that is the definition of flanderized. And people weren't happy with that. You can see lots of videos on YouTube right now, this is far from the only one, where people are complaining about how Shadow has been treated for the past 10 or so years and where he is today in the series. It's not a very rare opinion. So a lot of us were really happy when a few things started coming off, and this is really recent, this is after Frontiers, off of the Sonic social media channels that made it seem like they were actually trying to fix Shadow's character. Of course, we got Sonic Frontiers. That was a major fix to a lot of other big writing issues the series had been facing in the last 10 or so years. But Shadow wasn't present at all, which is fair. That game had a lot to juggle already, and it was very much a case of duct taping a good thing together out of very few resources. But in the subsequent year, we got the April Fool's game, Murder of Sonic the Hedgehog, which is this little free Steam visual novel where there's this whole story. It's Amy's birthday, they have this whole fake murder mystery story going on. It's pretty fun, it's pretty entertaining, but in that, we got to see a sweeter side to Shadow. We got to see a Shadow who was concerned about his friends or comrades or whatever you want to call them. He tried to get a birthday present for Amy, it didn't really work out. It's really cute, it's really fun, and Shadow is not supposed to be this adorable, sensitive guy, but he definitely is supposed to have depth. And that kind of attitude isn't that far-fetched from the Shadow we saw back in 06, right? So seeing him do anything that's a little bit more sweet, a little bit more nice, it felt refreshing, and we thought that maybe they were taking notes. Oh, we're trying to fix Shadow. There's also the Twitter takeovers, these little events Sega does pretty much every year or so, where they have some Sonic characters react to Twitter comments people send over the course of a few hours. And in that, especially the one we saw in 2022, right after Frontiers came out, we saw a version of Shadow that was willing to mention his backstory and be a little bit more open and talk about Maria, which is this huge piece of his old backstory that had been pretty much missing entirely for a long ass time, and things were starting to look up.
Question here from @Alknozka. Guys, what is your favorite hobby in your free time?
I'm volunteering at the local soup kitchen. I've been thinking a lot lately about what Maria would have wanted.
Oh, Shadow, that's so sweet.
I haven't been there in a few days. They've had some, choice words about my cooking.
Well, at least you're learning. Thanks for the question, @AlkNazca.
However, it was later stated by Ian Flynn himself, and also kind of inferable, that really that was just kind of a consequence of these projects being sort of outside of Sonic Team's scope. Murder of Sonic is arguably canon, arguably non-canon. It's debatable. We're kind of working on that, but it's fine either way. It's just a fun little story. And the takeovers are definitely not canon. They're supposed to be just these fun little things where the characters do funny stuff and say funny stuff, and you're not supposed to take it too seriously. It's self-parody. Sonic and Eggman, they're speaking terms, you know, they're frenemies. They joke about it in those videos themselves, right? So I don't think we can really take those products very seriously as far as moving Shadow's character to a different direction. Either way, that was kind of closer to what we wanted to see more of as far as Shadow's character actually goes. And until very, very recently, that was about it, right? We did get a few issues of the comics that portrayed Shadow a little bit better than he used to be in the past. They kind of just brushed off a little bit of his worst traits seen in the earlier issues of the comic, but it was still like this kind of plausible deniability kind of situation where he just didn't need to act all that selfishly, so he just didn't. Same goes for Sonic Prime, which I would argue actually is very much just the wrong characterization of Shadow. The fact that he's present and he does things is definitely a good step in the right direction, and some people liked his characterization there, but there's still a lot of that broodiness, that unwillingness to actually help out and participate and work together with other people. That just doesn't really work. So it's kind of been a little bit debatable, a little bit all over the place. But finally, now that we have this trailer for Sonic X Shadow Generation, Sonic Cross Shadow Generation, Sonic and Shadow Generation, Sonic Shadow Generations, Hunter fucking Hunter, I don't know, man, how they're supposed to read this. It's an X. Oh, why do they name it like this? There's a very good chance they're gonna get this character right, so let's look into it. This game, of course, is a remaster of Sonic Generations first and foremost. We got to see a little bit of the gameplay of the just general Sonic Generations portion of the product, and it seems to be nearly identical to the original release. It's clearly a little bit upscaled. I think the lighting looks a little bit better, but that might just be my head. People have been comparing it, and it looks nearly the same. The most interesting stuff here is the fact that we also got Shadow Generations, which is allegedly this whole new experience, this whole new story. The official site says this is a collection. This is not a remaster with an additional DLC thingy, right, taped into it. No, this is a combination of Sonic Generations and Shadow Generations, which is supposedly this whole new game, right? And in that, we got to see a lot of really interesting callbacks to Shadow's old stuff, pretty much. Even in the logo, the way Shadow's name is written, right? It has the old Shadow symbol back from Shadow 05, and according to the Steam description, his foe in the story is gonna be Black Doom, which again, is from Shadow 05. Back in the day, they wouldn't touch this with a 1,000-foot pole, right? You're acknowledging Shadow 05. And there's also, and I swear to God, I cannot find this online anywhere. I looked for like over 30 minutes and I just can't find it. I saw a description or like an interview somewhere back around when the game was announced, where they sort of alluded to Maria's existence again, where they mentioned like, oh, he's fulfilling his promise to an old friend, something to that effect. And I swear I saw it somewhere, but I cannot find it for the life of me. If you're watching right now, if you know what the source for this is, please let me know. I need to know. Otherwise, either trust me or believe it's some crazy delusion I thought up. Either way, it said in the stream description, this is gonna be Shadow facing his memories and facing his past again, which is really interesting because this requires acknowledgement of Shadow's previous stories, right? This requires that Shadow follows up on everything that happened before, and that includes those older games where he was in fact more present. And even from the trailer's vibe in general, we get to see like just, you know, hard rock music, Shadow doing a bunch of cool stuff, throwing chaos spears around and fighting the bio-lizard. It's awesome. It's awesome. This is Shadow, right? This is cool Shadow doing cool stuff. The freaking wasted all their budget on that single sequence where he's falling through that portal thingy and following like the Jet Black Arms alien and stuff. This looks awesome. This looks rad. This is Shadow. This is what we've been wanting. The trailer for Shadow Generations kind of emits this kind of really awesome, really badass, really kind of over the top, but in a really cool way, energy that Shadow's supposed to emit. And I think that has a lot to do with the Sonic movies. The Sonic movies, of course, have been a major influence for the games, and kind of the reason why the games are doing somewhat better than they used to nowadays. Sonic Frontiers was able to do a lot more thanks to the movies. The series is a way better spot financially thanks to those movies, and they have been only getting better as they go as far as story and quality is concerned. The first one was barely not a flop, and then the second one was genuinely really fun, and what they've been showing off Sonic Movie 3 genuinely seems amazing, and that of course includes the main draw of this movie, at least as far as we know right now, Shadow the Hedgehog. And people's reaction to Shadow's teaser back when the second movie came out and all of that, I believe kind of has shown Sega how much people actually are interested in this character. And I wonder if the movie staff had some input or kind of maybe influenced how the Japanese game development side of Sega thinks about the character too. Because naturally, as we're seeing slowly through the information we've been getting about Sonic Movie 3, they're gonna adapt Sonic Adventure 2 to some extent. They're gonna adapt Shadow's story. We're gonna see Maria, who's already been confirmed, and all that cool stuff. So naturally, that's also why we're seeing stuff like Shadow Generations and stupid Shadow onesie in Sonic Superstars. It's the year of Shadow pretty much, and not only is Sega trying to capitalize on that, but I imagine they're actually sort of seeing what the movie staff is cooking with this. See, the movie staff is already gonna adapt Adventure 2, and it's been received positively by people. Maybe like it's even a case of like, since the movie has way more financial value than the comics for Sega, maybe the movie staff is like, no, we're gonna adapt Adventure 2. And instead of saying no, like they said to the writers of the comics, we're like, no, Shadow's supposed to be this way. They're listening. They're like, oh, sure, if you want to do that, go ahead and do it. If you think it's cool, do it. And I believe the movie staff does think it's cool, and so does the audience, because people have been liking it, people have been excited for it. It looks awesome. So naturally, the games are gonna move back into that direction as well. You get to even see that in how people have been reacting to both of these projects. In the span of a single week, Sonic fans have been excited to see the same child character get shot in the head in two different pieces of media that are coming up. People are joking about Maria getting shot in the head in the Sonic movie. We don't know how that's gonna pan out ultimately, but there's even like articles going around like Sonic fans excited to see child character die. It's very funny conceptually, but it makes sense. That's really what we really mean by that is more depth for this character, acknowledgement of the backstory, yada yada, all that we've been talking about in this video. And the same thing has been said about Shadow Generations, right? We're excited to see Maria, hopefully. We're excited to see Shadow's backstory, hopefully, and see that get the proper respect it deserves. Either way, from what we can see, Sonic Cross Shadow Generations, Sonic X Shadow Generations, I don't care! The game looks cool, it looks hype, and I'm very much excited for it. And I hope you're as excited as I am, because this is gonna be goated, this is gonna be fire! Yeah! Let's fucking go. Can't wait for it. So yeah, that's about all I wanted to talk about today. This ended up being a lot longer than expected, but what do you know? It's Shadow the Hedgehog. Guys, pretty interesting. Let me know what you thought of the video in the comments below. If you liked it, remember to smash that like button, as they say. And if you didn't like it, let me know why in the comments. I'm always trying to improve here, and feedback is very much appreciated. So thanks again for watching, and see you guys next time. I just noticed throughout the video, my Mentos were perfectly placed here in the background in a way where it kind of looks like advertisement, like intentional advertisement, swear to God, it was just lying there. This isn't an endorsement. It's pretty good though, there's a reason I have it. It's a pretty sweet thing. Pretty sweet sweets, but not intentional.